It was the summer of 1982, and the quiet town of Maplewood seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, it was a postcard-perfect community where neighbors knew each other by name, and the only sound at night was the rustling of the trees. But even in the most serene places, secrets can fester, and when they surface, they can unleash devastating consequences. For the Thompsons and the Carter family, life had seemed almost idyllic. The Thompsons, Michael, a diligent insurance broker, and his wife Linda, a kindergarten teacher, were the kind of couple others envied. Their home was warm, their two children well-mannered, and their smiles always seemed genuine. Next door lived the Carters, a younger, livelier couple who had just moved to the area. Jack Carter was a contractor with a booming laugh and a penchant for beer on his porch, while his wife Emily was a petite brunette with piercing green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. The Thompsons had been the first to welcome the Carters to the neighborhood. It began with casual hellos and cups of coffee shared over the fence. Before long, the two families were spending weekends together. Barbecues, movie nights, and even camping trips. Their friendship became the talk of the neighborhood, the picture of harmony and camaraderie. But behind the smiles and laughter, there was a simmering tension that no one could see, a tension that would soon explode into a tragedy no one could have predicted. It started innocently enough, with Linda noticing how Jack would linger in conversations with her. He'd laugh a little too loudly at her jokes, his gaze lingering just a second too long. Michael, oblivious to subtlety, didn't notice at first. Linda brushed it off as harmless flirtation, until the day Jack accidentally brushed her hand during a game of cards. She froze, her cheeks flushing as Emily's eyes darted toward them. Emily, meanwhile, had her own reasons for feeling uneasy. Over time, she had noticed Michael's quiet admiration. He wasn't as boisterous as Jack, but there was a calm, magnetic intensity about him that made her feel noticed in a way Jack rarely did. She caught Michael's gaze lingering on her one too many times during their gatherings, his polite but probing questions making her feel both flattered and uncomfortable. What started as quiet attractions soon evolved into an unspoken arrangement between the two couples, something they called the experiment. It began one drunken night during a poker game, the kind where laughter echoed loudly, and inhibitions melted under the influence of too much whiskey. Jack, emboldened by alcohol, jokingly suggested swapping partners for a dance. Linda hesitated but, under Michael's reassuring smile, agreed. That night, the seed was planted. By the following weekend, the idea of a wife swap was no longer just a joke. What began as a playful experiment evolved into something much darker. Under the guise of fun, they rationalized their actions as a way to spice up their marriages. They set rules, boundaries that everyone promised to respect, but rules in such arrangements are rarely unbroken. The swap happened once, then twice, each time leaving a strange aftermath in its wake. At first, the couples seemed happier, more vibrant, but it didn't take long for cracks to appear. Michael started coming home late from work, his excuses paper-thin. Jack's jovial demeanor turned sharp, his jokes biting and his temper quick. Linda, always the mediator, found herself retreating into silence, while Emily began avoiding eye contact with anyone in the group. By the fall of 1982, the tension between the four was palpable. Neighborhood dinners turned into awkward affairs, filled with forced smiles and clipped conversations. Michael grew increasingly withdrawn, spending more time in his basement workshop. Jack, on the other hand, became possessive of Linda, his casual flirtations with her morphing into something more aggressive. One stormy night in late October, Linda confided in her closest friend, Susan, during a PTA meeting. Tearfully, she revealed that Jack had been showing up at her workplace unannounced, insisting on lunch dates. Emily, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly paranoid. She started locking her bedroom door at night, claiming she heard noises. The entire situation came to a head on November 3rd, 1982. It was a Thursday evening, cold and windy, with rain tapping against the windows. The Thompsons and Carters had agreed to meet at the Thompsons' house for dinner, a last-ditch effort to salvage their crumbling friendship. Linda spent the afternoon preparing a roast, while Michael paced the house nervously, glancing at the clock. By 7 p.m., the Carters arrived, their smiles brittle and forced. Jack brought a bottle of whiskey, which he promptly opened. The dinner began with strained small talk, but as the hours ticked by and the whiskey flowed, the tension in the room became unbearable. Linda excused herself to the kitchen, only for Jack to follow her moments later. When Emily realized Jack was gone, her eyes darted to Michael, who had been watching Linda intently all evening. Suddenly, she slammed her glass on the table, startling everyone. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice trembling with rage. The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, years of secrets, jealousy, and betrayal unraveled. What no one could predict was how far the fallout would go, or how devastating it would be for both families. The storm outside seemed to roar in unison with Emily's outburst, the wind howling against the windows as if warning of the chaos about to unfold. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of her accusation hung in the air like a dense fog. Jack was the first to break the silence, his voice laced with irritation. "What the hell is your problem, Emily?" he snapped, his hand tightening around his whiskey glass. Emily's piercing green eyes shifted from Jack to Michael, then to Linda, who had just stepped back into the dining room carrying a tray of dessert. Her gaze bore into Linda with an intensity that made her freeze mid-step. "My problem?" Emily hissed, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "My problem is that this experiment has gone too far. Don't think I haven't noticed the way you've been sneaking around, Jack. And you, Linda, acting so innocent. You think I'm blind?" Linda's face turned ashen, the tray slipping from her hands and crashing to the floor. Plates shattered, scattering shards of ceramic across the hardwood, but no one flinched. All eyes were now on her. "Emily, you're drunk," Michael interjected, his voice calm but firm. "Let's not do this here." But Emily wasn't listening. Her anger, simmering for weeks, had finally reached its boiling point. She pointed an accusatory finger at Michael. "And you," she spat, "sitting there like you're above all of this. You think I don't see the way you look at me? The way you've been following me? You're just as guilty as the rest of them." Jack's face reddened, a vein pulsing in his temple. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Don't you dare accuse me of sneaking around. If anyone's been sneaking, it's you. Always texting on your phone, disappearing for hours. What are you hiding, Emily?" Emily laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "Oh, that's rich coming from you. You think I don't know about the nights you've been working late? Or the calls you make when you think I'm asleep?" As Jack and Emily's voices grew louder, Linda retreated to the corner of the room, her hands trembling. Michael remained seated, his jaw clenched, watching the argument unfold with a mixture of unease and quiet calculation. "This was supposed to bring us closer," Jack shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "That's what we all agreed. But no, you had to ruin it with your paranoia and your accusations." "Closer?" Emily scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You call this closer? Look around, Jack. We're falling apart." Michael finally stood, his towering presence commanding attention. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but authoritative. "This isn't helping anyone." But Emily wasn't done. She turned to Linda, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Tell me the truth, Linda. How long has this been going on? How long have you and Jack been sneaking behind my back?" Linda's eyes filled with tears, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think, Emily. I swear. Not what I think?" Emily barked out a humorless laugh. "Then what is it, Linda? Enlighten me." Jack moved toward Emily, his hands raised as if to placate her. "Stop it, Emily. You're making a scene." But Emily wasn't backing down. Fueled by weeks of suspicion and anger, she grabbed the whiskey bottle from the table and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the wall, the amber liquid dripping down like blood. "Making a scene?" she shouted, her voice cracking. "You have no idea what I've been going through, Jack. No idea." Michael moved to Linda's side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We should all just calm down," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. But the tension in the room was too thick, the emotions too raw. Jack and Emily's shouting match escalated, their voices blending into a cacophony of accusations and denials. In the chaos, no one noticed Michael's gaze shifting toward the kitchen, where a large carving knife rested on the counter. The storm outside seemed to intensify, lightning illuminating the room in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder rumbled like an ominous drum roll, setting the stage for the nightmare that was about to unfold. Suddenly, Jack lunged toward Emily, his face twisted in rage. "You don't know when to shut up, do you?" he growled, grabbing her by the arm. Emily struggled against him, her eyes wide with fear. "Let me go, Jack. You're hurting me." Michael stepped forward, his voice sharp. "That's enough, Jack. Let her go." But Jack was beyond reason. His grip tightened, and Emily let out a cry of pain. That was when Linda, trembling but determined, grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel and swung it at Jack. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Jack stumbled back, releasing Emily. For a moment, everything was still. Jack touched the side of his head, his fingers coming away slick with blood. He looked at Linda with a mixture of shock and fury. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before anyone could react, Jack lunged at Linda, his hands wrapping around her neck. Linda gasped, clawing at his arms, her face turning red. Michael rushed forward, tackling Jack to the ground. The two men grappled, their movements clumsy and fueled by adrenaline. Emily stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth as she watched the scene unfold. Linda, gasping for breath, stumbled toward the kitchen, her eyes darting to the carving knife. Without thinking, she grabbed it, the cold steel feeling both foreign and familiar in her hand. "Stop!" she screamed, holding the knife in front of her. "Stop it, or I swear I'll—" But her voice was drowned out by the sound of the storm and the struggle between Michael and Jack. Emily, snapping out of her daze, rushed to Linda's side, her hands trembling. "We have to call the police," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Linda shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't. We'll lose everything." Before Emily could respond, Jack managed to throw Michael off of him. He staggered to his feet, his face twisted in rage. "You think you can threaten me?" he snarled, advancing toward Linda. The next moments happened in a blur. Linda screamed, the knife clutched tightly in her hands. Jack lunged, and in a desperate act of self-defense, Linda thrust the blade forward. Time seemed to stand still as Jack stumbled back, his hands clutching his abdomen where blood began to seep through his shirt. His eyes widened in shock, and he collapsed to the floor. Emily let out a piercing scream, dropping to her knees beside Jack. "Jack! Oh my God! Jack!" Michael moved to Linda's side, pulling the knife from her trembling hands. "We need to think," he said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to figure out what to do." Linda sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Emily's screams turned to wails as she cradled Jack's lifeless body. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling like a mournful lament. But the nightmare wasn't over. In their panic, no one had noticed the shadow moving outside the window or the faint sound of footsteps retreating into the darkness. Someone had seen everything, and the secrets that had been buried for so long were about to come to light. The storm raged through the night, its relentless winds rattling the windows of the Thompsons' home. Inside, chaos and fear reigned. Jack's lifeless body lay sprawled across the floor, a pool of blood seeping beneath him, staining the hardwood. Emily knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched his shirt, shaking him as though willing him to wake. "Jack!" she cried, her voice raw with anguish. "Please, wake up! Please!" Linda stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide and unseeing. Her hands, slick with Jack's blood, hung limply by her sides. Across the room, Michael paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had always been a man of composure, but now his carefully crafted calm was cracking. "Linda!" Michael said sharply, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Look at me! Look at me!" Linda's eyes slowly shifted to meet his, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I didn't mean to kill him." Michael tightened his grip, his voice firm but not unkind. "I know, but we can't fall apart right now. Do you understand? We need to figure this out." Emily's head snapped up, her grief transforming into fury. "Figure this out," she spat. "You're talking about covering this up? My husband is dead because of her." Linda flinched at Emily's words, her knees buckling. Michael steadied her, his jaw tightening. "Emily, calm down. This wasn't Linda's fault. Jack attacked her. It was self-defense." Emily's eyes blazed with anger. "Self-defense? You call stabbing him self-defense? She didn't have to kill him." The words hung in the air like a dagger, slicing through what little composure Linda had left. She let out a strangled sob and collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. Michael turned to Emily, his voice cold. "We don't have time for this. The neighbors might have heard something. We need to deal with the situation before someone calls the police." Emily stood, her fists clenched, her face a mask of grief and rage. "Deal with it? How, Michael? What are you suggesting?" Michael glanced at Jack's body, his mind calculating. "We clean up. We make it look like he left the house during the storm and didn't come back." Emily let out a bitter laugh, disbelief etched across her face. "You're insane. You think we can just make this disappear? People will notice he's gone. And what about me? What do I tell the police?" Michael stepped closer to her, his voice low and steady. "We say he stormed out after an argument. No one will suspect anything if we stick to the same story. Do you want your name dragged through the mud, Emily? Do you want people to find out about everything?" Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She knew what Michael meant. The wife swap, the secrets, the betrayals. If any of it came to light, it would ruin her life. She glanced at Jack's lifeless body, the reality of her situation sinking in. "Fine," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But this is on you, Michael. All of it." Michael nodded, relief flashing across his face. "All right, we need to move fast." As Michael and Emily began formulating a plan, Linda remained motionless, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. The knife, Jack's lunge, the way his eyes widened in shock as the blade pierced his chest. She couldn't escape the image, no matter how hard she tried. Michael turned to her. "Linda, I need you to pull yourself together. We're going to clean this up, and then we'll figure out what to do next." Linda nodded numbly, though her body felt like it was moving on autopilot. She followed Michael's instructions, retrieving cleaning supplies and towels. The metallic smell of blood filled the air as they worked to scrub the floor, their movements mechanical and desperate. Emily, meanwhile, stood by the window, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. She thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow darting across the yard. But when she looked again, there was nothing. Her paranoia was mounting, but she said nothing. The hours dragged on, and by the time the storm began to subside, they had managed to clean most of the blood and wrap Jack's body in a tarp. Michael insisted they move him to the garage until they could figure out the next step. As they dragged the body outside, Linda's grip faltered, and she stumbled, nearly dropping her end of the tarp. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't." "You have to," Michael snapped, his patience wearing thin. "We don't have a choice." Once Jack's body was in the garage, Michael closed the door and leaned against it, his chest heaving. "All right," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Now we need to get our stories straight." But before they could continue, the sound of a car engine echoed down the street. All three of them froze, their eyes wide with panic. The headlights of an approaching vehicle illuminated the driveway, and a wave of dread washed over them. "Who is that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael peered through the curtains, his jaw tightening. "It's the police." Linda's knees buckled, and she gripped the back of a chair for support. "Oh, God," she whispered. "They know. They know." "Shut up," Michael hissed, his mind racing. "We don't know why they're here. Just stay calm and follow my lead." The doorbell rang, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. Michael took a deep breath and opened the door, forcing a calm expression onto his face. Two officers stood on the porch, their uniforms damp from the rain. The older of the two, a stern-looking man with a graying mustache, spoke first. "Good evening. Sorry to bother you, but we received a call about a disturbance in the area. A neighbor reported hearing shouting and breaking glass." Michael feigned surprise. "A disturbance? Here? I'm not sure what they could have heard. We've been inside all night." The younger officer glanced past Michael, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the living room. "Mind if we come in? Just to take a quick look around." Michael hesitated, his mind racing. "Of course," he said finally, stepping aside. As the officers entered, Emily and Linda sat on the couch, trying to appear as calm as possible. Emily's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, while Linda stared at the floor, her face pale. "We've had some bad weather tonight," Michael said, trying to sound casual. "The storm's been rattling the windows. Maybe that's what the neighbor heard." The older officer nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. "Could be. Mind if we ask a few questions?" "Not at all," Michael replied, forcing a smile. The officers began asking routine questions. Who was home? What they'd been doing that evening? Michael answered smoothly, his responses rehearsed in his mind. But Linda's silence and Emily's trembling hands didn't go unnoticed. The younger officer's gaze lingered on Emily. "Ma'am, are you all right? You seem upset." Emily's eyes darted to Michael, who gave her a subtle nod. She forced a weak smile. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. It's been a long night." The officers exchanged a glance, their suspicions clearly piqued. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the older officer spoke. "All right, if you hear or see anything unusual, give us a call." Michael nodded, relief washing over him. "Will do. Thank you, officers." As the police left, Emily let out a shaky breath, and Linda buried her face in her hands. Michael locked the door and turned to them, his face grim. "They're going to come back," he said. "We need to move fast." But before they could formulate their next move, a soft knock came at the back door. All three of them froze, their blood running cold. Michael gestured for silence and crept toward the kitchen. Peering through the window, he saw a shadowy figure standing outside. The figure raised a hand and knocked again, the sound eerily calm. "What do we do?" Linda whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a knife from the counter and approached the door. He opened it slowly, revealing a man in his late 20s, his face partially obscured by the hood of his raincoat. "Can I help you?" Michael asked, his voice tense. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I saw everything," he said quietly. Michael's grip on the knife tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's smile widened, and he stepped closer, his voice a low whisper. "You can't hide this. You're all going to pay for what you've done." Before Michael could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a chilling sense of foreboding. The storm outside may have passed, but for